Are joining me now, Massachusetts Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me on, Shannon.
Okay, so let's start here, too. You've said a ceasefire is not a good idea until Hamas is destroyed, but I want to talk to you about this specific pause. Again, that Wall Street Journal piece says this: the ceasefire's terms allow Hamas to extend this truce by releasing 10 hostages a day as the possibility of a permanent truce nears, and as Hamas starts to trade adult, male, and military hostages, the group's demands will rise. The U.S. will pressure Israel to release hundreds of Palestinian terrorists. Has the pause been a good or bad idea, in your opinion, and what are your concerns with this conflict moving forward?
There's no such thing as good in this situation when there are still hostages being held in captivity, but there is progress, and this is progress. Hostages are being released. Humanitarian aid is coming in for Palestinian civilians. The Israeli Defense Forces are able to regroup as they prepare for operations to the south, where the bolus of Hamas leadership that's still in Gaza seems to be. And it's a testament to the president's strength and sagacity in ignoring calls for a ceasefire that would have denied Israel the leverage they needed to secure this deal. But Israel is right that this is the middle, not the end. They had two objectives going into this conflict. One is to rescue the hostages. There are still hostages being held captive. And two was to dismantle Hamas, and Hamas is still coherent. So they need to be prepared to turn south and to resume military operations. And I think they're going to have support from the American body politic in doing that. I represent an ideologically diverse district. I have a county that voted Republican. I have some of the bluest zip codes in the country. 3 months ago, this district was pretty united in opposition to Prime Minister Netanyahu's actions on judicial reform and settlement expansion in the West Bank. But now there is relative consensus that Israel has a right and responsibility to defend itself and to protect its civilians, even while recognizing that Netanyahu's hard-right cabinet has made things unnecessarily difficult with their actions in the West Bank. So I think Israel should continue and resume these military operations at the expiration of the truce, and I think the broad American electorate will be behind them.
So there's some conflict within your party over this whole thing. The New Yorker has this headline: how Israel is splitting the Democrats. The Democratic coalition once seemed united in its staunch, unquestioning support for the country. Today, that consensus seems to be cracking. How would you describe what's going on within the party? Because some of this is happening very publicly.
There are outliers, for sure. And the president has been wise to ignore those calls for ceasefire, which were reckless and misguided. And largely those outliers are speaking for their own political ends. But there is broad consensus amongst Democratic policymakers that President Biden has been drawing on his 50 years of foreign policy experience to walk a narrow tightrope over a wide chasm quite effectively. Now, that's in sharp contrast to the Republican Party over Ukraine. This is the party that, as we heard from Senator Cotton, likes to invoke Ronald Reagan, the man who helped liberate Ukraine from Russia. They're now prepared under the leadership of Donald Trump to hand Ukraine right back over to Russia. They are deeply divided by the leader of their party.
But wait, just a second there.
And that is the contrast that is most critical.
Oh, but to be fair, they have voted for aid again and again in the House and the Senate, Republicans. There is a split, of course, within the party, as there is within yours, on the issue of Israel. I mean, we've got Senator Sanders out there saying that no more blank checks to Israel. He thinks that aid should be conditional. I know that you have said you didn't think aid should be conditional, regardless of whether it's under a Democrat or Republican administration. You talk about the president's deep foreign policy experience, but it's one of the areas that our polling shows people don't trust him on. And when it comes to the issue of Iran specifically and how he's dealing with them, our brand new poll shows that 70% of Americans think that he's been too accommodating. Like Senator Cotton, you have served in uniform. You know about these attacks on our troops. At last count, at least 73 of them. What should he be doing differently with respect to Iran?
So first of all, this administration has been tough on Iran. They have rolled out almost 50 new sets of sanctions that have helped lead to almost 50% inflation in the Iranian economy. Iran is desperate right now. They have also advanced the Abraham Accords. And the thing that Iran fears more than military action by the United States, more even than economic action from the United States, is political isolation through the Abraham Accords. And that was a large near-term catalyst for Hamas's attack on October 7th. So the senator simply isn't correct that the administration has not been tough on Iran. But if we were to follow the Republican Party's warpath in the Middle East, where we would end up with is yet another failed forever war in that region. I served in 2012 in Afghanistan. I saw the futility, the expense of wars without a political endgame. The last thing America needs is to go back into that muck and blood of conflict in the Middle East. The better thing to do, the thing that I saw when I commanded special operations in Panama and helped train our allies there, is to work by and with fellow democracies as they fight on the front lines, to support Israel as they fight against Hamas in Gaza, to keep that to a one-front war as opposed to opening up other fronts against Hezbollah or against Iran directly, to support Ukraine as they fight against Russia, to support Taiwan as it prepares for increased Chinese aggression. The president is standing with democracy and he's working by and with allies, and that is smart military strategy.
But there are a number of GOP senators who have reached out to ask why this administration isn't using other things at its disposal, like sanctions. A letter to the president back on November 16th, they say the world is now seeing the direct result of allowing Iran's oil revenues to grow and unfreezing billions of dollars in extraterritorial bank accounts. We must prioritize enforcing all economic sanctions. So raises the question, why aren't we and why shouldn't we be?
We are. The president
Not to the fullest
has
extent.
been seizing Iranian oil exports. They have forced Iran to be selling their oil on the black market where they're not recovering the majority of the total revenue from those sales. They've expanded the number of sanctions against individuals, more than 400 different entities or individuals, including the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, for human rights violations and drone exports. This administration is economically isolating Iran at the same time as they are building greater Arab cohesion with Israel through the Abraham Accords. And again, that is the thing that Iran actually fears much more than a military strike from the United States, is isolation from the success of the Abraham Accords. That is why Hamas launched on October 7th its assault against Israel. And it's why that we need to continue to isolate Iran from the broader Middle East diplomatic
You've mentioned
accords.
the Abraham Accords
Let me give you an
multiple
example.
times, but let me ask you, do you credit the Trump administration with getting those done?
The Trump administration obviously was in power when those got done, and Netanyahu really was the prime mover behind those. But yes, it was a successful initiative that President Biden has helped strengthen. And what we have seen now is that instead of launching military assaults against every toxic regime in the Middle East, which would create 6 new wars by next weekend, the president has been transacting with countries like Qatar, which has funded Hamas just as Iran has, to help rescue these hostages. In the Middle East, you don't have good choices. You have tough policymaking criteria. And what the president has done is both resist calls for a ceasefire from the left, while resist calls for escalating into a full-blown war from the right. He is walking a central, statesman-like path.
Well, you are correct always in saying that there are no easy choices in the Middle East. Congressman Auchincloss, we thank you for your time and for your time in uniform for us as well. Sir, thank you.
Good to be with you.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.